Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 disturbing stories from the deep forests of North Carolina. These are tales of people who ventured into the ancient wilderness and encountered something that defies explanation. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The Pisgah National Forest stretches across western North Carolina like a dark green ocean. And if you grow up anywhere near Brevard, you learn pretty quickly that some parts of it feel different than others. There's this section off Forest Road 475 that my uncle always called the Quiet Mile because even the birds seem to avoid it. The trees grow differently there, all twisted up and leaning away from the trail like they're trying to pull their roots free and walk somewhere else. I inherited my uncle's hunting cabin when I was 31. He'd built it himself back in the 70s, and honestly, I'd only been there maybe 3 times as a kid. My memories were hazy, mostly the smell of wood smoke and my uncle's instant coffee, which he made so strong it looked like motor oil. The cabin sat about 2 miles off the main road, accessible only by a path that barely qualified as a trail. When the lawyer handed me the keys, she mentioned that my uncle hadn't actually stayed there in the last 5 years of his life. He'd kept paying the property taxes but stopped going up. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was late October when I finally made the drive up from Charlotte. The leaves had already turned, and the forest looked like it was on fire in the afternoon light. I'd taken a Friday off, planning to spend the weekend cleaning the place out and deciding whether to sell it or keep it. My wife thought I was crazy for going alone, but I'd grown up hiking these mountains, or at least I thought I had. The trail to the cabin was worse than I remembered. Overgrown in places, with roots that grabbed at my boots and branches that seemed positioned specifically to scratch my face. I was hauling a backpack full of cleaning supplies and a cooler with enough food for 3 days. By the time I spotted the cabin through the trees, my shoulders were aching and I'd already tripped twice. The cabin looked smaller than my childhood memories suggested, but it was in better shape than I'd expected. The roof was intact and the windows, though filthy, were unbroken. I'd brought the key, but the door wasn't locked. That should have struck me as odd, but I just figured my uncle had stopped bothering in his later years. Inside smelled like mildew and mouse droppings. Dust covered everything in a thick gray blanket, and there were cobwebs in every corner that looked like they'd been there since the Bush administration. The first Bush administration. I spent the rest of the afternoon sweeping and wiping things down, opening windows to air the place out even though it meant letting in the cold. The temperature was dropping fast, that mountain cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. I'd brought a battery-powered lantern because I wasn't sure if the generator still worked. Turned out it didn't, so I was glad I'd planned ahead. By the time I got a fire going in the stone fireplace, it was fully dark outside. That's when I noticed the notebook on the mantel. It was one of those cheap composition notebooks with the black and white marbled cover. I picked it up thinking maybe it was my uncle's, maybe some hunting notes or maintenance records for the cabin. The handwriting inside was his, but it wasn't what I expected. The first entry was dated June 3rd, 5 years ago. Heard it again last night, it said. Same pattern, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, stops right at midnight. I flipped through more pages. Entry after entry, all variations on the same theme. Sounds at night, footsteps circling the cabin, the feeling of being watched. In one entry from August, he'd written, saw the dirt by the east window this morning. Handprint, but the fingers are too long, almost a foot long each. I measured. The last entry was from September 14th, 5 years ago. Just one sentence, I'm not coming back here. I closed the notebook and set it back on the mantel. My hands were shaking, but I told myself it was just from the cold. My uncle had been in his 70s by then. Maybe he'd been confused, getting paranoid in his old age. Maybe the isolation had gotten to him. People's minds can play tricks when they spend too much time alone in the woods. I made myself a can of soup on the camp stove and tried to read by the lantern light, but I kept glancing at the windows. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind of dark you only get miles from any artificial light. I couldn't see anything beyond the glass, just my own reflection staring back at me, looking more nervous than I wanted to admit. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to get some sleep. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, but the mattresses looked like crime scenes, so I brought a sleeping bag. I set it up on the couch near the fireplace where I could keep the fire fed through the night. I was almost asleep when I heard it. 3 distinct taps. A pause, 3 more taps, another pause, 3 taps. I sat up so fast I nearly rolled off the couch. The sound was coming from the east side of the cabin, the same side my uncle had mentioned in his notebook. It wasn't loud. If I'd been fully asleep, I might not have noticed. But in the silence of that cabin, with nothing but the pop and crackle of the fire, those taps rang out like gunshots. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the east window. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The tapping had stopped. I shone the light through the window, sweeping it back and forth across the ground outside. The beam caught something pale near the base of the cabin wall. A hand. No, not a hand. It was too large, too elongated. The fingers stretched out across the dirt like bare tree roots, each one as long as my forearm. They were pale enough that they almost seemed to glow in my flashlight beam, and they were perfectly still. As I watched, they slowly began to retract, sliding backward into the darkness beyond my light. I stumbled away from the window, nearly tripping over my own feet. Every rational thought in my head was screaming that it was a trick of the light, a branch, a root, anything but what I'd just seen. But I knew what I'd seen. Those fingers had joints. They'd bent as they pulled back into the shadows. The tapping started again. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, but now it was coming from the north side of the cabin, then the south side, then the west. It was circling the building, maintaining that same steady rhythm. I stood in the center of the main room, flashlight clutched in my hand, turning in slow circles as the tapping moved around me. Whatever was out there was walking around the cabin, stopping at each wall to tap 3 times before moving on. The pattern continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the tapping. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too fast. I could hear the fire settling, but from outside, nothing. No wind through the trees, no animals, no insects. Just a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on that couch with my flashlight in one hand and my uncle's notebook in the other, reading his entries over and over. As dawn finally started to creep through the windows, I began throwing my things back into my backpack. The door was slightly ajar when I went to leave. I knew I'd closed it the night before. I knew it. But now it stood open about 6 inches, and when I pushed it fully open and stepped onto the small porch, I saw them. Marks in the dirt, not footprints exactly, but impressions, long, narrow depressions in the ground that circled the entire cabin. They were spaced evenly, each one about 3 feet from the next. At the east window, there was a clear print of that hand. 5 fingers, each impossibly long, splayed out in the dirt like someone had pressed down hard. I took one photo with my phone, then I ran. I didn't care about the cleaning supplies or the cooler or anything except getting back to my truck. I crashed through the underbrush like something was chasing me, though when I looked back, nothing was there. Nothing I could see anyway. I sold the cabin through a real estate agent without ever going back. The new owners were from Florida, looking for vacation property. I sometimes wonder if they've heard the tapping, if they've seen those fingers pressed against their windows. I think about calling them, warning them. But what would I even say? I still have that photo on my phone. I've never shown it to anyone, not even my wife. Sometimes late at night, I pull it up and stare at those long, pale fingers spread out in the dirt, and I try to convince myself that my uncle was just paranoid, that I'd let his notebook get into my head, that what I saw wasn't real. But then I remember how those fingers moved, how they bent at the joints as they slowly pulled back into the darkness. And I delete the photo again, knowing I'll just restore it from my deleted folder a few days later. Some things you can't let go of, even when you desperately want to. Story 2. Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest sits right up against the Tennessee border, and if you've never been, it's hard to explain how different it feels from other parts of North Carolina. The trees there are old, I mean really old, some of them 400 years or more, and they grow so thick that even at noon, the forest floor stays dim. My girlfriend Sienna and I went there for a camping trip in early June, back when we were both still in college and thought we were invincible. We picked a campsite about a mile from the parking area, right next to a stream that bubbled over smooth stones. The sound of that water was hypnotic. We spent the first day just hiking around, taking photos of the massive trees and trying to guess their ages. Sienna was studying forestry, and she kept stopping to examine different species, running her hands over the bark like she was reading Braille. That first night was perfect. We cooked hot dogs over our fire, drank cheap beer we'd carried in, and lay on our backs watching stars appear through the canopy. Sienna fell asleep around 11, but I stayed up later, feeding the fire and listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl somewhere nearby, the creek, the wind moving through branches 100 feet above my head. I must have dozed off in my camp chair because I woke up suddenly, disoriented, with no idea what time it was. The fire had burned down to embers, giving off just enough light to see the outline of our tent. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't hear the creek anymore, couldn't hear anything at all. Then I heard Sienna's voice from somewhere in the trees behind our tent. "Trevor," she called. "Trevor, can you help me?" I stood up so fast, the camp chair fell over backward. My heart was pounding because Sienna's voice had come from the wrong direction, from deep in the forest, not from inside the tent where she was supposed to be sleeping. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the tent. The zipper was still closed from the inside. "Trevor," the voice came again, still from the trees. "I'm lost. I can't find my way back." My mouth had gone completely dry. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and shone my light inside. Sienna was there, sleeping in her bag, curled up on her side. Her phone was next to her pillow, screen dark. "Trevor, please." The voice was moving now, circling our campsite, staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. "It's so dark out here, I'm scared." It sounded exactly like her. Same inflection, same slight rasp she got when she was tired. But Sienna was sleeping 5 feet away from me, her breathing slow and steady. I crawled into the tent and shook her shoulder. She woke up confused, groggy. What's wrong?" "SHH," I whispered, putting my hand over her mouth. "Something S out there, don't talk." Her eyes went wide and I felt her go rigid. We sat there in the tent, barely breathing, as the voice continued to call my name from the darkness. It circled our campsite 3 times, always staying just out of sight, always sounding like Sienna begging for help. Then it stopped. We waited in silence for maybe 10 minutes. Finally, Sienna whispered, "What the fuck was that?" "I don't know." "That was my voice, Trevor. That was exactly my voice." We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We sat in the tent with our flashlights on and our pocket knives in our hands. Not that knives would do anything against whatever was out there, but holding them made us feel slightly less helpless. As soon as we could see gray light through the tent fabric, we started packing up. Sienna was rolling up her sleeping bag when she froze. "Trevor," she said quietly, "look at this." There were marks on the outside of the tent, Long scratches in the nylon like someone had run their fingernails down the side, but the marks were too high, 7 feet up at least, well above where a person could reach without standing on something. And we both knew those marks hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. We didn't bother with breakfast. We just stuffed everything into our packs and started hiking back toward the parking area. The forest felt different in the early morning light. The trees seemed to lean in toward the trail, and that stream we'd camped next to, I couldn't hear it anymore, even though we were walking right beside it. About halfway back, Sienna grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. Footsteps somewhere behind us on the trail, not heavy, not rushing, just someone walking at a steady pace matching our speed. "Keep going," I said, "don't look back." We walked faster. The footsteps behind us sped up. We started jogging, our packs bouncing against our backs. The footsteps matched our pace exactly. When we stopped to catch our breath, the footsteps stopped too. Sienna turned around before I could stop her. She stared back down the trail for a long moment, then grabbed my hand. Her palm was slick with sweat. "What is it?" I asked, too terrified to look myself. "Nothing," she said. "There's nothing there, but I can still hear it walking." We ran the last quarter mile to the parking area. The footsteps followed us the entire way, steady and unhurried, never getting closer but never falling behind. They stopped the moment we reached the parking lot, cutting off mid-step like someone had pressed a pause button. We threw our gear in the car and got out of there. Sienna was shaking so hard she could barely buckle her seat belt. I kept looking in the rear-view mirror as we drove away, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees, but the forest was empty. Broke up 2 months later. Not because of what happened, or at least that's what we told ourselves, but we couldn't be around each other without thinking about that night, hearing her voice calling from the darkness. Sometimes I still dream about it. In the dreams, I follow the voice into the trees and I find Sienna standing in a clearing, her back to me. When she turns around, her face is wrong. Her mouth opens too wide, splits at the corners, and her voice comes out, but it's not calling for help anymore. It's laughing. Last year, I read a news story about a hiker who went missing in Joyce Kilmer Forest. They found his campsite abandoned, his tent scratched up like something had tried to get in. His phone was still there, and when the rangers checked it, they found a voice recording he'd made. In the recording, you can hear him talking to someone. "Melissa," he says, that was his girlfriend's name. "Melissa, where are you?" This isn't funny. But Melissa had been in Charlotte the entire time. She hadn't gone on the trip with him. She stayed home because she had to work. They never found his body. Story 3. My grandfather owned 40 acres of woodland outside of Robbinsville, back up against the Snowbird Mountains. When I was growing up, he used to take me hunting there every fall, mostly squirrel and turkey, nothing too serious. We'd spend hours walking those woods, and he'd point out different trees and tell me stories about his own grandfather clearing the land for farming back in the 20s. Most of those old fields had grown back to forest by the time I came along, but you could still see the stone walls that used to mark property lines, half buried under decades of leaf litter. There was one part of his property we never went to, a hollow on the western edge where the creek ran through. My grandfather called it the low place, and the few times I asked about it when I was a kid, he'd just shake his head and say it wasn't good for hunting. The deer didn't go there, he said. Neither did anything else. I was 24 when he died, and I inherited the land. My parents wanted me to sell it. Neither of them had any interest in keeping property that far from civilization, but I'd always loved those woods. I decided to spend a week camping there in the spring, reconnecting with the place before I made any decisions about what to do with it. I set up camp where my grandfather and I used to park his truck, in a clearing near an old tobacco barn that was slowly collapsing in on itself. The barn had a rusted tin roof that banged when the wind picked up, and swallows had built nests in every corner. I spent the first 2 days hiking around, relearning the trails I'd walked as a kid. Everything was smaller than I remembered. The creek I'd thought was so wide I could barely jump across it was only 4 or 5 feet bank to bank. The hills I'd struggled to climb were gentle slopes. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike to the low place. I was an adult now, I reasoned. If there was something wrong with that hollow, I'd judge it for myself. I found the creek and followed it west, into the part of the property I'd never seen. The trees changed the deeper I went. The oaks and hickories gave way to hemlock and rhododendron, so thick I had to push through like I was moving through a tunnel. The air felt heavier somehow, harder to breathe. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees, and I could see my breath misting in front of my face, even though it was nearly 70 degrees in the clearing where I'd set up camp. The hollow opened up suddenly, and I almost tumbled down a short embankment before catching myself on a sapling. Below me was a natural bowl in the landscape, maybe 100 feet across. The creek pooled there, forming a shallow pond that was perfectly still despite the current flowing in and out. The trees around the edges all leaned away from the water, their trunks bent at odd angles like they were trying to uproot themselves and flee. In the center of the pond was a shape. I thought at first it was a fallen tree, but as I stared at it, I realized it was too regular, too symmetrical. It looked almost like a cage, branches woven together in a dome shape about the size of a garden shed. Vines had grown over it, but underneath I could see the deliberate structure of it, the way each branch had been carefully placed and tied. I didn't want to go closer, but I couldn't stop myself. I worked my way down the embankment and walked to the edge of the pond. The water was so clear I could see every pebble on the bottom, every piece of waterlogged wood, but there were no fish, no tadpoles, no water striders, nothing alive at all. The cage sat in maybe a foot of water 30 feet from shore. As I stared at it, I noticed something pale inside, tangled in the branches. It looked like cloth, but the color was off, too white, almost luminescent in the shadows under the dome. I waded in. The water was ice cold and made my feet ache immediately. Each step felt wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere sacred or cursed or both. When I got close enough, I reached out and touched one of the branches. The entire structure collapsed, just fell apart like it had been held together by nothing but good intentions. Branches splashed into the water and that pale thing inside floated to the surface. It wasn't cloth. It was a skin, like a snake skin, but roughly human-shaped. Arms, legs, a torso. The head was the worst part. It had eye holes and a mouth hole, and the mouth was stretched too wide, like whatever had worn this skin had been screaming when it molted. I scrambled backward so fast I fell, soaking myself to the chest in that freezing water. The skin floated there, empty and impossibly whole, bobbing gently on the surface of the pond. Then it started to sink. Not slowly, it dropped like someone had tied weights to it, disappearing into the depths in seconds, even though I'd just seen that the pond was only a foot deep. I ran, crashed back through the rhododendron, scraped my face and hands on branches, didn't care. I could hear something behind me, not footsteps, but a sound like breathing. Slow, deep inhalations followed by long, rattling exhales. Whatever was breathing was huge, its lungs working like bellows. I didn't stop running until I reached my camp. My clothes were soaked, my hands were bleeding, and I was shaking so hard I couldn't grip my tent stakes when I tried to pull them up. The sun was starting to set, and the last thing I wanted was to be on that property after dark. I left everything, tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, all of it, just grabbed my car keys and ran to where I'd parked at the edge of the property, a quarter-mile from the clearing. I was fumbling with my keys when I saw something on my windshield, a handprint, pale and massive, the fingers easily 10 inches long. It looked wet, like someone had just pressed their hand against the glass. As I watched, the print began to fade, evaporating in the evening air until nothing remained but a slight smear. I got in the car and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw something pale standing at the edge of the trees where my grandfather's property began. It was tall, 7 feet at least, maybe more. Its arms hung down past its knees, and even from a distance I could see that its proportions were all wrong. Everything too long, too thin, like someone had taken a human and stretched it on a rack. I sold the property a month later to a timber company. They cleared the whole 40 acres, including the hollow. I looked at aerial photos after they'd finished logging, and where the pond had been was just dry ground, as if there'd never been any water there at all. Sometimes I think about that skin floating in the water, and I wonder what had worn it. I wonder if there are more of them, and if the cage had been a trap or a prison or something else entirely. Mostly, though, I try not to think about it. I try not to wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed until after dark, or if I'd touched that skin when it was floating on the surface. My grandfather knew something about that hollow. He'd kept away from it for decades, and he'd made sure I did too when I was young. I wish I'd asked him about it before he died, but I'm not sure he would have told me. Some things you don't talk about. You just stay away, and you make sure the people you care about stay away too. I drive past that property sometimes, can't help myself. The trees they planted after logging are growing in fast, already 10 or 15 feet tall. Give it another 20 years and you won't be able to tell it was ever clear-cut. The forest always comes back. I just hope that whatever was in the hollow doesn't come back with it. Story 4. Nantahala National Forest has thousands of miles of trails, and most people stick to the popular ones. Whitewater Falls, Way Bald, the usual spots you'll find on Instagram. But there are older trails too, logging roads from the 30s and 40s that aren't on modern maps but still exist if you know where to look. My buddy Garrett and I had gotten into geocaching that summer. This was maybe 6 years ago, and we'd found coordinates for an old cache that supposedly hadn't been visited in over a decade. The coordinates led to one of these forgotten logging roads, way up on the north side of the forest near the Tennessee line. We parked at a pullout where the pavement ended and hiked in on what used to be a road, but was now basically just 2 parallel ruts with grass growing between them. It was late July, stupid hot even in the shade, and the humidity made it feel like we were breathing through a wet blanket. Garrett was more into the geocaching than I was, honestly. He had the GPS and was watching it like his life depended on it, calling out when we needed to turn or backtrack. I was mostly there for the hike, and because Garrett's wife had kicked him out for the weekend after some fight about his mother visiting. He needed to blow off steam, and I didn't have anything better to do. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we found the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map we'd checked, but there it was, sitting about 50 yards off the old road in a stand of pines. It was small, maybe 12 by 12, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of old bone. The roof looked like it might have been tin at one point, but now it was mostly rust and holes. "Check that out," Garrett said, already walking toward it. "That's way older than I thought anything up here would be." The cabin had one window, but the glass was long gone, and the door hung crooked on leather hinges that had dried and cracked with age. We walked around it first, looking for a historical marker or any sign of who'd built it. There was nothing, just this lonely structure sitting in the middle of nowhere, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. "Should we look inside?" Garrett asked. I shrugged. We came all this way. The door scraped against the floor when we pushed it open, and a smell rolled out that made both of us step back. Not decay exactly, but something organic and wrong, like mushrooms and old meat and wet dog all mixed together. The inside was dim, just the light from the door and window, but enough to see by once our eyes adjusted. There wasn't much in there. A rusted iron bed frame with no mattress. A small table that had 3 legs and was propped up on rocks where the 4th leg should have been. Some shelves on one wall that were sagging under the weight of old mason jars filled with things I didn't want to look at too closely. What got my attention was the floor. Someone had drawn on it in charcoal or ash or something dark, symbols in a circle that surrounded a square in the center of the room. The square was maybe 3 feet on each side, and the boards inside it looked newer than the rest of the floor, like they'd been replaced at some point. "The fuck is this?" Garrett said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "This is some Blair Witch shit." I wanted to leave, but Garrett was already walking around the room taking photos of everything. He picked up one of the jars from the shelf and held it up to the light from the window. Inside was something pale and preserved in cloudy liquid. It might have been a root, it might have been something else. "Put that back," I said. "Relax, nobody's been here in years. Look at the dust on everything." But that wasn't quite true. There was dust, sure, thick layers of it on the shelves and the table. But the floor in the center of that circle was clean. Not spotless, but cleaner than it should have been. Like someone had swept it recently. Garrett noticed it too. He walked to the edge of the circle and looked down at the symbols. "You think this is some kind of a cult thing, like devil worship or whatever? I think we should go find that geocache and get out of here." He was about to answer when we heard it, a sound from under the floor. Scratching, slow and deliberate, long dragging scrapes like fingernails on wood. We both froze. The scratching came again directly under the square of newer boards in the center of the circle. 3 long scrapes, a pause, then 3 more. "There's a crawl space," Garrett whispered. "Something under the cabin." The scratching stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my heart hammering in my ears. Then we heard breathing, deep, wet breaths coming from below us, from whatever was in the crawl space beneath the cabin. Garrett moved first, backing toward the door. I was right behind him, neither of us taking our eyes off that square of floor. The breathing got louder, faster, and then something hit the underside of the boards with a bang that made us both jump. We ran. Didn't discuss it, didn't plan it, just bolted out that door and back toward the old logging road. Behind us I heard wood splintering, but I didn't look back. We crashed through the underbrush, thorns tearing at our clothes, and somewhere behind us something was moving through the trees. I could hear branches breaking, hear something large forcing its way after us. We made it back to the logging road and ran down it like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. The sounds of pursuit faded after a few minutes, but we didn't slow down until we could see Garrett's truck through the trees. We both leaned against the truck, gasping for air. My shirt was soaked through with sweat and my legs felt like rubber. Garrett was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to fit the key in the door lock. "Did you see it?" I asked. "No." "No." We got in the truck and locked the doors, which seemed stupid but also necessary. As Garrett started the engine, I looked back toward the trail. Nothing moved in the shadows between the trees, but I had the distinct feeling that something was watching us leave. On the drive back, neither of us spoke much. It wasn't until we were almost back to Asheville that Garrett said, "I'm deleting those photos." "Good." But when he checked his phone, the photos were already gone. He'd taken at least a dozen pictures inside that cabin, but his camera roll showed nothing. Just the photos from earlier that morning at breakfast, then nothing until we'd gotten back to the truck. I've thought a lot about that cabin over the years, about the symbols on the floor and the sounds from the crawl space. Mostly I've thought about those newer boards, the square in the center of the circle. Someone had replaced them, which meant whatever was down there, someone had put it there. Someone had drawn those symbols, arranged that circle, and sealed something in that crawl space. Or maybe they'd been trying to keep something out. Last year I tried to find the cabin again on satellite imagery, just out of curiosity. I spent hours scanning that area of the forest, looking for that clearing with the pines. I couldn't find it. The GPS coordinates Garrett had used for the geocache didn't exist anymore. The cache had been archived, the coordinates deleted. Sometimes I wonder if we stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be found. If that cabin only appears to certain people, or if it moves. That sounds crazy, I know, but I remember the sound of those boards splintering as we ran, and I remember something in Garrett's voice when he said he was deleting those photos. Relief, sure, but also fear. The kind of fear that comes from seeing something you can't unsee, knowing something you can't unknow. We don't talk about it anymore, Garrett and I. We still hang out sometimes, still go hiking now and then. But we stick to the main trails now, the ones crowded with families and day hikers. The ones where you can always hear other people's voices through the trees, where you're never really alone, where nothing waits beneath the floor. Story 5. My cousin Delilah got a job with the Forest Service right out of college, doing field surveys in the Owari National Forest. It's not glamorous work, basically hiking through miles of woods with a GPS and a clipboard, cataloging tree species and checking for signs of disease or beetle infestation. She'd been doing it for about 3 months when she called me one night, sounding strange. Not scared exactly, but off balance. She asked if I could come down for the weekend, said she needed someone to talk to about something that had happened during a survey. I drove down from Greensboro that Friday evening. Delilah lived in a small apartment in Troy, right on the edge of the National Forest. When I got there, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun, still wearing her work clothes even though it was past 7. She made coffee, bad coffee, the kind that comes in a can, and we sat on a tiny balcony while she told me what had happened. 2 days earlier, she'd been surveying a section of forest north of Highway 24, an area she'd never been to before. It was supposed to be an easy day. The terrain was relatively flat and the section wasn't very large. She parked at a service road and hiked in with her equipment around 9 in the morning. The work was boring but meditative. She'd mark waypoints on her GPS, note down tree species and diameter measurements, take photos of anything unusual. By noon, she was about halfway through the section and stopped to eat lunch on a fallen log. That's when she noticed the tree. It stood about 30 yards off to her left, and at first glance it looked like all the other pines in that area, but something about it caught her eye. The bark was strange, too smooth, and it had a pattern to it that didn't look natural. She walked over for a closer look. It was covered in writing, she told me, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she was trying to warm them even though it was 75 degrees out. Not carved into the bark, written on it with something dark, ink maybe or paint. The writing went all the way around the trunk, from about waist height up to maybe 10 feet. I couldn't read most of it. Some of it looked like it might have been English but was too faded, and some of it was symbols I didn't recognize at all. She'd taken photos of it, documentation for her report. Then she'd continued her survey, putting the tree out of her mind as one of those weird things you sometimes find in the woods. People carved their initials or spray-painted rocks all the time. This was just more elaborate than usual. About an hour later, she'd found another tree just like it. Same smooth bark, same dark writing covering the trunk. Then another and another. She documented 8 of them total, all within a quarter-mile radius, all marked with the same strange writing. I started to get this feeling, Delilah said, like I'd walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. The trees were arranged in a pattern, I'm pretty sure of it. If you looked at them on a map, they'd probably form a shape, like they were marking the boundary of something. She'd finished her survey as quickly as she could and hiked back to her truck. But when she'd gotten there, she'd found something on her windshield. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. A piece of bark, stripped from a tree and about the size of her palm, propped up under the wiper blade. Written on it in that same dark substance was a message. Counted. I hadn't told anyone where I was going that day. she said. Nobody knew I was out there, and I was parked on a service road that barely anyone uses. Someone would have had to follow me in. She reported it to her supervisor, shown him the photos of the marked trees and the bark message. He'd been concerned enough to send a ranger out to check on the area the next day. The ranger had found the marked trees. Delilah's photos confirmed their locations, but the writing was gone. Every tree had been scrubbed clean, the bark roughed up like someone had gone over it with a wire brush, and there were no other signs of human activity in the area. No tracks, no trash, no indication that anyone had been there recently except for Delilah. My supervisor thinks I faked the photos, she said. Not directly, he didn't say it, but I can tell. He thinks I'm looking for attention or trying to manufacture some kind of interesting discovery to make my reports stand out, but I didn't fake anything. Those trees were written on, and someone left that message on my truck. I didn't know what to tell her. The rational explanation was that someone had been in the woods when she had seen her documenting the trees, and had left the message as some kind of prank or warning. But that didn't explain why they'd been watching her closely enough to know she was photographing the trees, or how they'd cleaned all the writing off before the ranger could document it. "Have you gone back?" I asked. She shook her head. "I'm supposed to do a follow-up survey of that section next week. Standard protocol for areas where we've noted unusual activity. But I don't want to go alone." I ended up going with her. I'm not sure why, maybe because she was family, maybe because I was curious, maybe because some part of me didn't believe her story and wanted to see for myself. We drove out there on a Wednesday morning, taking one of the Forest Service trucks. Delilah was quiet the whole drive, her hands tight on the steering wheel. The section of forest looked like any other part of the Owaries. Pine and oak scattered undergrowth, the morning sun filtering through the canopy in lazy columns. We parked at the same service road and hiked in, following the GPS waypoints from a previous survey. We found the trees, all 8 of them exactly where Delilah had marked them on her GPS. The bark was rough and weathered, showing no signs that anything had ever been written on them. We walked the circuit, examining each tree carefully, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. "They were here," Delilah said, more to herself than to me. I didn't imagine it. We were standing near the center of the pattern, surrounded by the marked trees when we both heard it. Footsteps in the dry leaves, moving slowly, deliberately. They seemed to be circling us, staying just out of sight behind the trees. "Hello," I called out. "Forest Service, identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own breathing, could hear Delilah's breath catch. Then a voice called out from the trees, coming from a direction where the footsteps had just been. 8 trees, 1 survey, 2 visitors. It was a man's voice, flat and emotionless. "Counted." The footsteps resumed, still circling. I pulled out my phone to call the ranger station, but I had no signal. Delilah grabbed my arm and pointed. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I saw someone moving. Just a glimpse, a figure in dark clothes, tall and thin, moving with a strange gait that didn't quite look natural. "We should leave," Delilah whispered. We walked back toward the truck, trying not to run, trying to stay calm. The footsteps followed us but never got closer. Whenever I glanced back, I'd catch a glimpse of that figure moving parallel to us, keeping pace but never approaching. We didn't run until we were in sight of the truck. We got in and locked the doors. Delilah started the engine with shaking hands. As we pulled away, I looked back one last time. The figure stood at the edge of the trees where the forest met the service road. It was too far away to make out details, but I could see it was tall, abnormally tall, maybe 7 feet, and its arms hung too long at its sides. Delilah quit the Forest Service 2 weeks later. She didn't tell them why, just said the work wasn't for her and moved back to Greensboro. She won't talk about what happened, and I don't push her. But sometimes when we're together, she'll go quiet and stare off into space, and I know she's thinking about those trees and that voice in the woods. I still have the photo she showed me that first night, the piece of bark with COUNTED written on it. I've studied it for hours, trying to figure out what the writing is. It's not ink or paint. It looks almost like dried blood, dark brown and flaking at the edges. There are other marks on the bark too, symbols scratched into the surface that I didn't notice at first. They look almost like tally marks, 8 sets of them. Story 6. The fall I turned 38, I got laid off from my job in Durham and decided to spend a month hiking sections of the Mountains to Sea Trail. It was either that or sit in my apartment applying for jobs I'd probably never hear back from, and I figured the trail would at least give me time to think. I'd always been the kind of person who made decisions better when I was moving, when my body was tired enough that my brain couldn't spin in circles. I'd been on the trail for about 2 weeks, camping at established sites and the occasional hostel, when I decided to take a detour off the main route. There was an old settler's cemetery marked on my map, about a mile off the trail near Linville Gorge. I'd gotten interested in genealogy the year before and thought it might be cool to see if any of the names matched up with family trees I'd been researching. My great-great-grandmother had supposedly come from somewhere around there, though the records were spotty. The side trail was barely maintained, just a narrow path through dense laurel thickets that grabbed at my pack and scratched my face. But it was marked with occasional faded blazes, so I followed it up a steep ridge and down into a hollow where the cemetery sat. It was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 20 graves total, most of them marked with simple field stones that had no names or dates. A few had carved markers, but the writing was worn almost smooth by more than a century of weather. I spent about an hour walking around, taking photos of the ones I could still read, making notes about the names and dates. That's when I noticed the fresh grave. It was on the far edge of the cemetery, partially hidden by an overgrown holly bush. The soil was dark and loose, recently dug, I'd guess within the last few days. There was no marker, no stone, just a rectangular patch of disturbed earth about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This cemetery was on public land, and there were strict regulations about burials. Nobody could just dig a grave here without permits and official procedures. And even if they'd somehow gotten permission, why would they bury someone in an old cemetery that hadn't been used in over 100 years? I was pulling out my phone to report it, though I had no idea who to report it to, when I noticed something sticking out of the dirt at one end of the grave. A piece of wood, carved and weathered, pushed into the soil like a marker. I should have left it alone. I should have reported what I'd found and let the authorities deal with it. But curiosity got the better of me. I walked over and pulled the wooden marker out of the ground. It was a small placard, about the size of a book, with words burned into the surface. The name was unreadable, worn away, or maybe never clear to begin with. But below the name was a date, the current year. And below that, burned in letters that were still dark and sharp, were 3 words, WALKED too far. My hands went numb. I dropped the marker and stepped back from the grave. That's when I saw the footprints. They led away from the grave, pressed into the soft soil of the cemetery. Bare footprints, human-shaped but wrong. The toes were too long and the heel was narrow, almost pointed. The stride was impossibly long. The prints were spaced almost 6 feet apart, like whatever had made them had taken enormous, bounding steps. The trail of footprints led into the woods beyond the cemetery, in the opposite direction from where I'd come in. I followed them with my eyes, watching as they disappeared into the shadows between the trees. As I stood there, I heard something moving in the forest. Slow, deliberate sounds, branches breaking, leaves rustling. Something large was moving toward the cemetery. I ran. crashed back through the laurel thickets, not caring that my pack was catching on every branch, not caring that I was probably getting completely turned around. I just needed to get away from that cemetery and whatever was walking through the woods behind me. I must have run for 10 minutes before I stopped, gasping for air, my legs burning. I'd lost the trail completely. The forest around me was thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel, and I couldn't see more than 15 feet in any direction. I pulled out my GPS and tried to get a reading, but the signal was weak, the device taking forever to triangulate my position. That's when I heard my name, not shouted, not called out, whispered, like someone was standing right behind me, their mouth inches from my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the dense undergrowth and the play of shadows in the afternoon light. My GPS finally got a fix. I was about a quarter mile from the main trail, though in completely the wrong direction from where I thought I was. I started moving, using the GPS to navigate through the thickets, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I heard my name 3 more times before I reached the trail. Each time it was closer, the whisper more distinct, until the last time I could feel breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp. When I finally burst out onto the main trail, I nearly collided with 2-day hikers heading north. They took one look at me wild-eyed, bleeding from a dozen scratches, my pack half torn off my shoulders, and asked if I was okay. I told them I'd gotten lost, taken a wrong turn, panicked a little. They seemed to accept that. One of them offered me water from his bottle, and I drank it gratefully, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold it. I hiked another 3 miles to a road crossing and caught a ride into the nearest town. I didn't go back to the trail. I called a friend to come pick me up, drove back to Durham, and started applying for jobs like my life depended on it. About a week later, I called the ranger station responsible for that section of the Mountains to Sea Trail. I told them about the cemetery and the fresh grave, said I'd stumbled on it by accident and thought someone should check it out. The ranger I spoke to was polite but skeptical. She said they'd send someone out to take a look and thanked me for the report. I never heard back from them. I called twice more, but both times I was told the ranger who'd taken my report was unavailable and nobody else seemed to know anything about it. Eventually, I gave up. I've thought about that grave a lot, about the marker with the date that couldn't possibly be right and the words WALKED too far. I've wondered if whoever was buried there had hiked into that cemetery just like I did. If they'd seen something they shouldn't have, if they'd heard their name whispered in the woods. Mostly, though, I've wondered if that grave was already occupied when I found it, or if it was waiting for someone. I've wondered if I escaped something, or if I just postponed it. Sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed in my apartment, I hear my name. A whisper so faint I can almost convince myself I'm imagining it. It's always from a direction where nothing should be, from inside my closet, from the bathroom with the door closed, from the corner of the room where the shadows are thickest. I tell myself it's just my imagination. That what happened in those woods was a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and panic. But then I'll catch a smell, damp earth and decay, and I'll remember those footprints leading away from the grave, those impossible strides disappearing into the forest. And I'll wonder if I really escaped at all, or if something followed me home. Story 7. My brother Donovan convinced me to go camping with him in Croatan National Forest back in 2019. We'd grown up hiking together when we were kids, but we drifted apart after high school. He joined the Marines, and I'd gone to community college and ended up managing a hardware store in Wilmington. The camping trip was supposed to be a way to reconnect, do some fishing, drink some beers, tell stories about the old days. Croatan is different from the mountain forests in western North Carolina. It's coastal, flat, full of moccasins, those weird bog areas with standing water and twisted trees that look like they're straight out of a fairy tale. The forest has a reputation for being haunted, though whether that's because of genuine supernatural activity or just because the landscape looks creepy, I've never been sure. We set up camp at a primitive site near the Neuse River, far enough from the main campground that we had the area to ourselves. The site was just a cleared patch of ground with a fire ring and a rusty metal post that probably used to have a site number on it. Spanish moss hung from every tree, swaying in the breeze coming off the river, and the constant drone of insects was almost deafening. That first evening went exactly as planned. We caught a few small bass, cooked them over the fire with some potatoes and onions Donovan had brought, and worked through a six-pack while talking about nothing important. It felt good, normal, like we were kids again. By the time we crawled into our tents around midnight, I was more relaxed than I'd been in months. I woke up around 3 in the morning because I needed to piss. The campfire had burned down to nothing but glowing coals, and the forest was completely dark, that deep, absolute darkness you only get miles from civilization. I grabbed my flashlight and walked about 30 yards from camp, far enough that I wouldn't accidentally hit the tents when I relieved myself. I was standing there half asleep when I saw the light. It was moving through the trees maybe 100 yards away, a soft greenish-white glow that seemed to float about chest height off the ground. At first, I thought it was another camper with a lantern, but the light moved too smoothly, never bobbing or swaying like it would if someone was carrying it. It just glided between the trees, steady and unhurried. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds before my brain fully woke up and reminded me that we were supposed to be alone out here, that the nearest campsite was 3 miles away. The light was moving toward our camp, though slowly, like it was in no particular hurry. I finished up and walked back to the tents, moving quietly. I didn't know why I was being quiet, but some instinct told me not to make noise, not to draw attention. I unzipped Donovan's tent and shook his shoulder. "Hey," I whispered. "Wake up! There's something out there." He mumbled something incoherent and tried to roll over, but I shook him harder. "Donovan, wake the fuck up, I'm serious." That got through. He sat up, instantly alert in that way military training teaches you. "What?" "There's a light in the trees. Moving this way." We both crawled out of his tent. The light was closer now, maybe 70 yards away, still gliding between the trees. In its glow, I could make out the twisted shapes of the moccasin vegetation, the hanging moss casting strange shadows. "What the hell is that?" Donovan said. His voice was tight, controlled. "I don't know." We stood there watching as the light came closer. 50 yards, 40, it never paused, never deviated from its path. It was definitely heading straight for our campsite. "Should we say something?" I asked. "Let them know we're here." "That's not a person," Donovan said flatly. He was right. I'd known it from the moment I saw the light, but I'd been trying to rationalize it, to find an explanation that made sense. But there was no person carrying that light, no lantern swinging from a hand. The light itself was the thing, and it moved with a purpose that made my skin crawl. "We should leave," I said. "Yeah." We started grabbing our gear, moving fast but trying not to panic. I threw stuff into my pack without organizing it, just cramming in whatever I could reach. Donovan was doing the same, both of us keeping one eye on the light as it drifted closer. It was 20 yards away when we heard the singing. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing something that might have been a lullaby. The words weren't in English, might not have been in any language, just sounds that almost formed words. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees and the ground and the air itself. "Go," Donovan said. "Go now." We ran, leaving half our gear scattered around the campsite. We crashed through the underbrush toward where we'd parked Donovan's truck, about a quarter mile away on a service road. Behind us, the singing continued, never getting louder but never fading either, just that constant ethereal voice following us through the darkness. I glanced back once and wished I hadn't. The light was at our campsite now, and in its glow I could see something standing next to where our tents had been. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its outline blurred like it wasn't quite solid. As I watched, it raised one arm and pointed in our direction. The singing stopped. What replaced it was worse, a sound like wet breathing, labored and thick, coming from all around us. And underneath it, footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, running through the forest parallel to us, keeping pace. We burst out onto the service road and ran for the truck. Donovan fumbled with his keys, dropped them, cursed, found them again. The footsteps were closer now, crashing through the underbrush on both sides of the road. I couldn't see what was making them, but I could hear branches breaking, hear the impact of feet hitting packed dirt. Donovan got the truck started and we peeled out, gravel spraying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I saw shapes emerge onto the road where we'd been standing. 3 of them, maybe 4, too tall and moving in a way that wasn't quite right. Then the darkness swallowed them, and we were around a bend and accelerating toward the main road. We didn't stop until we hit Highway 70, and even then we only stopped long enough to catch our breath and check that nothing had followed us. We'd left everything, tents, sleeping bags, fishing gear, half of our clothes. Donovan reported it stolen when he got home, filed an insurance claim. We never told anyone what really happened. A few months later, I read a news article about a hiker who disappeared in Croatan. They found his campsite abandoned, all his gear still there, but no sign of the hiker himself. His tent was unzipped from the outside, and his boots were sitting neatly by the entrance like he'd taken them off before stepping out. They searched for 2 weeks but never found him. The article mentioned that several witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the forest the night he disappeared. Locals called them ghost lights and said they'd been reported in that area for decades. The article treated it like folklore, like something quaint and harmless. But I've seen those lights, I've heard that singing, and I know that the man who disappeared didn't just wander off and get lost. He followed something into those woods, or something came to his campsite and took him. Either way, he's not coming back. Donovan and I don't talk about that night. We've only discussed it once, about a year later when we'd both had too much to drink at a family barbecue. He told me he has nightmares about it sometimes, dreams where he's back in Croatan and the light is in his tent with him. And when he looks up, there's something lining over his sleeping bag, its face too close to his and its features all wrong. I didn't tell him I have the same dreams. Some things you keep to yourself, even from family, especially from family. Story 8. I used to do wildlife photography as a side hustle, selling stock photos to magazines and websites. It didn't pay much, but it got me outside and gave me an excuse to spend weekends in places most people never visit. In the spring of 2021, I got a commission from a nature magazine to photograph black bears in the South Mountain State Park area. They were running a feature on wildlife recovery in North Carolina and wanted shots of bears in their natural habitat. I'd scouted locations for about 2 weeks, setting up trail cameras in areas where I'd seen bear sign, scratched trees, scat, overturned logs. One of my cameras had captured some good footage of a sow with 2 cubs visiting a small creek at dawn, so I decided that's where I'd set up for my shoot. I got there about an hour before sunrise, hauling my camera gear and a portable blind down a trail that was barely more than a game path. The creek was in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep ridges covered in thick forest. It was the kind of place that felt isolated even though I was less than 2 miles from the nearest road. The only sounds were the creek burbling over rocks and the occasional call of a bird waking up. I set up the blind about 40 yards from the creek, positioning it so I'd have a clear view of the spot where the bears had been visiting. Then I settled in to wait, camera ready, barely breathing. Wildlife photography is 95% boredom and 5% frantic activity when your subject actually appears. The sun came up, turning the forest from black to gray to green. I saw deer, a few squirrels, a pileated woodpecker that hammered on a dead snag for what felt like hours, but no bears. By mid-morning, my back was aching from sitting still, and I was starting to think I'd wasted my time. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, just a hint of something off in the air. Like roadkill, but stronger and more organic. As I sat there, it got worse, until I was breathing through my mouth to avoid gagging. Something was dead nearby and had been for a while. I was debating whether to pack up and move to a different location when I saw movement across the creek. Something large, maybe 60 yards away, moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was the bear I'd been waiting for, and I raised my camera, finger on the shutter. But it wasn't a bear. It was walking upright, moving between the trees with a strange, shambling gait. I got a glimpse of pale skin, too pale like it had never seen the sun, and long arms that hung down almost to its knees. The head was wrong somehow, tilted at an angle that looked uncomfortable, maybe even painful. I kept my camera up, taking photos by instinct even though my hands were shaking. The thing moved along the opposite ridge, never looking in my direction until it disappeared behind a stand of laurel. I sat frozen in the blind for at least 5 minutes, heart hammering, trying to process what I'd just seen. It had to be a person, right? Someone hiking in a weird way, maybe injured or disoriented. But that pale skin, those 2 long arms, nothing about it had looked quite human. Finally, I worked up the courage to leave the blind. I needed to get out of there, but I also needed to cross the creek to reach the trail back to my car, which meant I'd be passing close to where that thing had been. I packed up as quietly as I could and started toward the creek. The smell was overwhelming now, so strong I had to stop and retch before continuing. When I reached the creek bank, I saw what was causing it. There was a pile on the opposite bank. At first, I thought it was a garbage dump. People are assholes and dump trash in the woods all the time. But as my brain processed what I was seeing, I realized it was bones. Animal bones, dozens of them, maybe more. Deer skulls, rib cages, leg bones, all piled in a cairn about 4 feet high. The bones were stripped clean but not weathered. These were recent kills. And arranged around the bone pile driven into the soft earth of the creek bank were sticks. Long, straight branches sharpened to points, forming a fence around the pile, or maybe a warning. I took 3 photos, then I ran, splashed through the creek, not caring that I soaked my boots, and scrambled up the opposite bank. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, every tree looking the same, every turn feeling wrong. I kept glancing back, expecting to see that pale figure following me, but the forest behind me was empty. I made it back to my car and threw my gear in the trunk, hands shaking so hard I could barely fit the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw something standing at the edge of the trees where the trail began. Tall, pale, watching my car pull away. I didn't stop driving until I hit Highway 226. When I got home, I downloaded the photos from my camera. Most of them were useless, blurry shots of trees and underbrush from when my hands had been shaking, but 3 photos were clear enough to see details. The first 2 showed the bone pile and the stick fence around it. The third photo was the one that made me stop breathing. It was the figure in the woods. I'd caught it in the frame without realizing, partially hidden behind a tree trunk. The image was sharp enough to see details I hadn't noticed in the moment. Its skin wasn't just pale, it was mottled, covered in patches of darker discoloration like bruises or mold. Its head was tilted at that wrong angle because its neck was impossibly long, at least twice as long as a human neck should be. And its face, I deleted the photo. Then I deleted it from my trash folder. Then I deleted the bone pile photos too, and for good measure, I formatted the entire memory card. I never went back to South Mountain State Park. I told the magazine I hadn't gotten the shots they wanted, that the bears weren't cooperating. They were disappointed but understanding. They found another photographer. Sometimes I regret deleting those photos. They were evidence, proof that what I saw was real. But mostly I'm glad they're gone, because that face, even in a photo, even on a tiny camera screen, had been wrong in ways I don't have words for. The eyes too large, the mouth splitting too far back along the jaw, the expression that wasn't quite curiosity or hunger but something in between. I still do wildlife photography sometimes, but I stay close to roads now, stick to popular trails where there are other people around. I tell myself I'm getting older, being more cautious, playing it smart. But really, I'm just afraid of what I might find if I go too far into the woods alone. Afraid I might see that figure again, standing at the edge of my blind, its too long neck bent as it stares at me with those over-large eyes. Afraid it might be building another pile of bones, and wondering if this time some of them might be human. Story 9. The summer after my divorce, I rented a cabin on private land north of Mount Jefferson. The owner was some guy in Florida who'd inherited the property from a relative and never visited. He just needed someone to check on the place and make sure squatters hadn't moved in. In exchange for free rent for 3 months, I agreed to do some maintenance and keep an eye on things. It seemed like a good deal at the time. Quiet, isolated, cheap. Exactly what I needed while I figured out what to do with my life. The cabin was old but solid, built from chestnut logs back before the blight killed all the trees. It sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with a dirt road leading out to the nearest highway about 4 miles away. The inside was basic: 1 main room with a wood stove, a small bedroom, a bathroom that barely qualified as such. No Wi-Fi, spotty cell signal, no TV. It was like stepping back in time 50 years. I moved in on a Friday in late June, hauling boxes of my stuff up the rutted driveway in my beat-up Subaru. The owner had left a binder full of instructions: how to prime the well pump, where the circuit breakers were, what to do if the septic backed up. At the back of the binder was a handwritten note that said, "If you hear knocking at night, don't answer the door. It's probably just raccoons." Probably, that was the word that stuck with me. The first week was fine. I spent my days hiking around the property, making a list of repairs that needed doing, and my evenings reading by lantern light. It was peaceful in a way my life hadn't been for years. No arguments, no lawyers, no tension, just me and the woods and the sound of wind in the trees. The knocking started on my 8th night there. I was in bed reading, or trying to read. My eyes were getting heavy when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Boom, boom, boom. I sat up wide awake. It was past midnight, and I was 4 miles from the nearest neighbor. Nobody should be at my door. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded thin and uncertain. No answer, just silence. I got out of bed and walked to the front window, peeking through the curtain. The porch was empty, illuminated by the yellow glow of the bulb I'd left on. Nothing moved in the clearing beyond. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening. When nothing else happened, I convinced myself it had been a branch falling on the roof or an animal bumping against the door. I went back to bed. The knocking came again an hour later. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same volume. This time I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. I stood there with my hand on the knob, my heart racing, trying to work up the courage to open it. "Who's there?" I called through the door. Nothing. I looked out the window again. Still nothing on the porch, nothing in the clearing. I was starting to feel foolish, jumping at sounds in an old cabin in the woods. Of course there would be sounds, trees, animals, the house settling, nothing to worry about. The knocking came every night after that, always the same, 3 slow knocks, always around midnight and again around 1 a.m. After the first few nights, I started to expect it, to prepare for it. I'd wait with my flashlight, determined to catch whatever was making the sound. But I never saw anything. On the 10th day, I was clearing brush from around the cabin when I found the rocks. They were arranged in a circle in the woods about 30 yards from the back of the cabin, each rock about the size of my head, partially buried in the forest floor. In the center of the circle was a depression in the ground, like something had been dug up and filled back in. I didn't like it. Something about that circle of stones made my stomach tighten. But I told myself it was just some old property marker or decoration, nothing to worry about. I went back to clearing brush. That night the knocking was different. Instead of 3 knocks, it was 5. And instead of coming from the front door, it came from the back wall of the cabin, right behind the bedroom where I slept. I didn't get up to check. I lay in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, listening as those 5 knocks repeated every few minutes for over an hour. When they finally stopped, I could hear something else. Footsteps on the back porch, slow and measured, walking back and forth. In the morning, I checked the back of the cabin. There were marks in the dirt below the bedroom window, like someone had been standing there. The impressions were deep, suggesting weight, but they weren't quite right. Too narrow, with strange toe marks that looked more like claws than human feet. I called the owner in Florida. Told him about the knocking, about the footsteps, asked if he knew anything about the circle of stones in the woods. He was quiet for a long time before answering. My uncle used to own that land, he finally said. He was into some weird shit, spiritual stuff, I guess you'd call it. When he died, my dad inherited the property but wouldn't go near it. Said there were things in those woods that weren't natural. What kind of things? He never said exactly, just that my uncle had done something, made some kind of deal or pact or whatever, and it had consequences. Look, I should have told you before you moved in, but I really needed someone to watch the place. If you want to leave, I understand. I'll refund your deposit. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pack up and get out. But where would I go? I'd given up my apartment, couldn't afford rent anywhere else, and had no desire to crash on a friend's couch like some kind of charity case. So I stayed. The knocking got worse, started coming from different parts of the cabin, the walls, the ceiling, under the floor. Sometimes it would be quiet for days and I'd start to think it was over. Then it would start up again, worse than before. 5 knocks became 7. 7 became 9, always odd numbers, always in groups. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, started sleeping on the couch in the main room with a baseball bat next to me and all the lights on. The power bill was going to be insane, but I didn't care. 3 weeks into my stay, I woke up at dawn to find the front door standing wide open. I knew I'd locked it. I'd checked it 3 times before going to sleep. But there it was, hanging open, letting in the cool morning air. Scratched into the wooden floor right in front of the threshold was a message, carved deep into the old boards with something sharp, counting down. I started packing immediately. Threw my stuff in boxes and bags, didn't bother organizing, just grabbed everything I could carry in one trip. I was loading the last box into my car when I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet. Its body was wrong, proportions all off, limbs too long and thin. Its head was bare and pale, and as I watched, it tilted to one side, considering me. Then it raised one hand and knocked on the tree next to it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The sound echoed across the clearing, and I swear I could feel each knock in my chest like a physical blow. I got in my car and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see it standing there watching me leave. It didn't move, didn't follow, just watched. I never went back for the rest of my stuff, never even called the owner to explain why I'd left. I just disappeared, found a new apartment in Boone, and tried to forget about that cabin and the thing in the woods. But sometimes late at night, I hear knocking. Not on my apartment door, on my bedroom wall, or on the ceiling above my bed, or from inside my closet. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, a reminder that something knows where I am, that whatever countdown it was keeping track of isn't over yet. I've started sleeping with my lights on again. Story 10. I'd been working as a surveyor for Graham County for about 6 months when they sent me out to document an old homestead site near Lake Santitla. The land was being considered for a heritage designation, and they needed official measurements and photographs of the remaining structures before they could move forward with the paperwork. The site was accessible only by boat on the far side of the lake where development had never reached. My supervisor, Kenneth, dropped me off from the county boat around 8 in the morning, promising to pick me up at 4. He handed me a GPS unit, a camera, measuring equipment, and a two-way radio. "You got everything?" he asked as I stepped onto the muddy shore. "I think so." He looked past me at the forest rising up from the waterline, his expression troubled. "There's supposed to be an old cabin about a quarter-mile in and some outbuildings. Do your work and be back here by 4. Don't go wandering off." "I'll be fine." "I'm serious. This side of the lake has a reputation. People have gotten turned around in there and had to be searched for. Keep track of your landmarks." I assured him I would, and he motored away, leaving me alone on the shore. The sound of the boat engine faded quickly, absorbed by the dense forest, and I was left in a silence that felt almost oppressive. I found the trail easily enough, an overgrown path that led inland, marked occasionally by old blazes on trees. The forest here was beautiful in a haunting way, all second-growth hardwoods and tangles of rhododendron. Vines had reclaimed most of the trail, and I had to push through them in places, ducking under branches and climbing over fallen logs. The cabin appeared suddenly, materializing out of the green shadows like it had been there all along but invisible until I was close enough. It was larger than I'd expected, a proper 2-story structure with a stone chimney and a front porch that had partially collapsed. The roof was mostly intact, though saplings were growing out of the shingles in places. I spent the next few hours measuring the structure, taking photos from multiple angles, documenting the construction techniques and materials. It was tedious work, but I found it soothing. There was something peaceful about being alone in the woods with a clear task, my mind occupied with measurements and numbers. I was photographing the stone foundation when I noticed the cellar door. It was set into the ground at the back of the cabin, almost hidden by overgrown weeds. The wooden door had rotted through in places, and I could see darkness beyond. I should have left it alone. My job was to document the structures, not explore them, but I was curious. I pulled out my flashlight and pried the cellar door open, the wood crumbling under my hands. Stone steps led down into darkness. The air that flowed up from below was cold and damp, carrying a smell like old earth and something metallic. I descended carefully, testing each step before putting my weight on it. The cellar was small, maybe 10 by 10, with a packed dirt floor and stone walls, empty except for some old mason jars on a shelf and what looked like the remains of root vegetable storage bins. I was about to head back up when my flashlight beam caught something scratched into the stone wall. Words carved into the rock with something sharp. I moved closer to read them. "Left IT in the walls. Don't let it out." I was still trying to make sense of that when I heard something moving above me in the cabin. Footsteps, slow and heavy, walking across the floor of the room directly overhead. Each step made the ceiling boards creak and drop dust onto my head. I turned off my flashlight and stood perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, then back again. Pacing, like someone was trapped up there and looking for a way out. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited in the darkness, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might be audible. When nothing else happened, I turned my flashlight back on and climbed the steps as quickly and quietly as I could. The cabin was empty when I emerged. Dust and leaves covered the floor, undisturbed except for the path I'd made when entering. No footprints but my own, no sign that anyone else had been there. I should have left right then. Should have gathered my equipment and headed back to the shore to wait for Kenneth, even if it meant sitting there for hours. But I still had work to do, the outbuildings to document, measurements to take. So I convinced myself I'd imagined the footsteps, that old houses settle and make noise, that there was nothing to worry about. I found the first outbuilding about 50 yards from the main cabin. It had been a barn or shed, but the walls had collapsed, leaving only the foundation and some scattered boards. As I was photographing it, I noticed something odd about the stones in the foundation. They were arranged in patterns, symbols that looked almost like writing. I knelt down to get a closer look. They were the same symbols I'd seen in my uncle's notebook, the same ones I'd seen scratched into the cellar wall. Characters that weren't quite letters, arranged in strings that weren't quite words. My hands started shaking. I stood up and backed away from the ruins, and that's when I realized I could see someone through the trees. A figure, standing about 100 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak. Tall, too tall, with proportions that weren't quite right. I grabbed my equipment and started walking quickly back toward the main cabin, back toward the trail that would lead me to the shore. I didn't run. Some instinct told me that running would be a bad idea, that it might trigger something, but I moved fast, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The figure was following me, maintaining the same distance, moving when I moved, stopping when I looked back. I could never quite see it clearly, always partially hidden behind a tree or obscured by shadows, but I could sense its attention, could feel its eyes on me. When I reached the trail, I started running. I didn't care about triggering anything anymore. I just needed to get back to the lake, back to where Kenneth would be waiting. The path seemed longer than before, the landmarks unfamiliar, and for a terrifying minute I thought I'd gotten turned around. But then I saw light through the trees, the open water of the lake, and I burst out of the forest onto the muddy shore. Kenneth's boat was there, right on time, and I'd never been so happy to see another human being in my life. "You okay?" he asked as I climbed in, noting my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that. Can we just go?" He didn't ask questions, just started the engine and pulled away from shore. As we headed across the lake, I looked back at the forest. Something tall and pale stood at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. When I got back to the office, I filed my report and told my supervisor I didn't feel comfortable working solo surveys on that side of the lake anymore. He didn't argue, just assigned me to different areas. I never asked if anyone else had reported strange experiences there. I didn't want to know. 2 months later, the heritage designation was denied. The official reason was structural instability. The buildings were too deteriorated to be safely preserved. But I found out later that the surveyor they'd sent to do a follow-up inspection had refused to complete the work. He'd entered the main cabin, heard something in the walls, scratching, he said, like something trying to get out, and had left immediately. The homestead site is still there, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. As far as I know, nobody goes there anymore. The county has written it off, let it return to the woods. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some places are meant to be forgotten, left alone with whatever lives in their walls and walks through their empty rooms. I still do surveying work, but I only take jobs where I can see civilization from where I'm standing, where I can hear traffic or see buildings or know that other people are nearby. The deep woods, the isolated places, I leave those for someone else. Someone who hasn't heard footsteps in an empty house, who hasn't seen something tall and wrong following them through the trees. Someone who doesn't know yet that there are places where the map ends but the forest doesn't, where the work of the living disturbs the work of the dead, where something waits behind every tree and watches with patient, hungry eyes. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.